Nobody paid attention to the janitor mopping the hallway outside the Joint Intelligence briefing room until he opened his mouth and spoke flawless Arabic that wasn't just conversational, but carried the precise dialect and cadence of a former intelligence officer embedded in the Middle East. Within hours, Pentagon security had locked down 3 departments, a 4-star general had halted a top-level operation, and the mystery man with a mop was no longer invisible. What followed not only changed the careers of everyone in that room, it shook the foundations of how the U.S. military defined expertise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was 4:52 a.m. when Raymond Khoury unlocked the East Maintenance Corridor of the Hartman Strategic Operations Building, a cold steel complex attached to the Pentagon's intelligence wing, like a tumor they'd rather not talk about. Raymond had worked this shift for nearly 9 years. Every weekday, he pushed his supply cart, faded gray with a squeaky wheel that nobody had ever offered to fix, down the same pattern of corridors, cleaning up the detritus of men and women who carried more security clearance in their lanyards than most countries had in their entire infrastructure. He knew every corner of the building, not just because it was his job to know, but because he had mapped it long ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with janitorial duties. To anyone watching, Raymond was exactly what he appeared to be. An aging immigrant in his late 50s, with graying hair that curled just above his ears, posture that slouched from decades of manual labor, and a face worn not just from time, but from carefully maintained obscurity. His badge read, Level 1 Maintenance Access, which meant he couldn't even use the cafeteria in the main hall without an escort. No one made eye contact unless they needed something. When people addressed him, it was in clipped tones, usually prefaced by, "Hey," followed by a request to clean up after some spilled coffee or a burst ceiling tile. He always nodded silently, offered a faint smile, and did exactly what was asked of him. But Raymond was more than what he seemed. And the morning that started with him wiping down a fingerprint-smudged security panel would be the morning everything changed. The building was on edge that day. Whispers of a high-level intelligence leak were circulating among the senior officers, and the tension was palpable. From the overheard fragments Raymond caught, and he always listened, even when no one knew he could, a diplomatic incident had erupted between the U.S. and a coalition of Gulf states, triggered by the sudden exposure of a covert surveillance program. The morning briefing, scheduled for 0600, was to involve 4 generals, the Defense Intelligence Agency's deputy director, and a translator from the Office of Military Linguistics. Raymond was polishing the metal strip beneath the secure room's entrance when 2 junior officers walked by, speaking in hushed tones, not noticing the janitor crouched beside them. They discussed the translator, a new hire named Linda, fluent on paper, but shaky in high-pressure situations. One mentioned she'd been pulled in last minute because the original linguist had gone dark in Yemen. The phrase, "this could blow up in our faces," was uttered with unsettling frequency. Raymond kept wiping the baseboard, slow and deliberate. He knew the file they were referring to. He had seen its contents the night before, not by hacking into any system, but because someone had printed the wrong document on the unsecured printer in the logistics office and left it unattended for 17 minutes. He had picked it up, read it in full, memorized every line, and then shredded it like the waste it appeared to be. What the officers and the high command didn't know, what no one in the building had ever guessed, was that Raymond Khoury wasn't just fluent in Arabic. He was born in Al-Zarqa, Jordan, raised in Damascus, Syria, educated at the University of Cairo, and trained by the British before spending 12 years as an undercover linguistics asset embedded in war zones for NATO intelligence. He had listened to terrorists plan operations in whispered slang only used in the southern slums of Baghdad, translated bomb manuals scrawled in tribal Pashto masquerading as Arabic, and served as the only voice in a room full of volatile men who didn't know he worked for the other side. When the U.S. had shuttered one of its secret human intelligence branch after a scandal, Raymond had quietly retired with his records sealed and scrubbed, his assets transferred, and his life redirected. They gave him a name, a fabricated background, and a job that would ensure no one ever asked him anything again. Janitor. But Raymond had never stopped listening, and today, he would have to do more than listen. At 6:03 a.m., the translator stammered. Her voice, amplified over the secure room's intercom, hesitated on a verb that shifted the meaning of a regional treaty clause from joint cooperation to religious assimilation. The Saudi attaché attending virtually flinched. The general, a tall, silver-haired titan named Gerald R. Westbrook, snapped his fingers in frustration. The moment passed quickly, but the damage lingered. Raymond, standing just outside the hallway with a mop in hand, took a breath. No one had noticed him watching. No one had noticed him file away the dialectic slip. No one had noticed that Raymond Khoury had just made a decision that would, within the next 24 hours, trigger a chain reaction across military intelligence, alter the careers of 4 senior officers, and call into question everything the Pentagon thought it knew about its personnel. But that would come later. For now, he just turned away, pushed his cart slowly toward the next hall, and vanished again into the margins. Until he didn't. Raymond returned to the maintenance wing just after 6:30 a.m., moving slowly past the security checkpoint where 2 junior MPs glanced at him with the same lack of interest they had for the past decade. The younger one, new by the look of his awkward uniform fit, gave a half-hearted nod. Raymond responded with the same slow blink and silent step that made him so easy to forget. That was the point. The less they remembered about him, the longer he could remain invisible. But today, even in the obscurity of his role, Raymond could feel the shift in the air. Something was coming. The briefing room's error had triggered more than just a political ripple. It had set off a cascade of urgency through the upper echelons of military command. Misinterpretation of Arabic phrasing in diplomatic agreements wasn't a clerical issue. It was a matter of national security, one that could escalate into international conflict if not corrected swiftly and with authority. But instead of turning inward for careful analysis, the leadership, as always, scrambled to tighten appearances. Blame would be assigned before solutions were found. The hierarchy moved faster to shield itself from embarrassment than to fix what was broken. In the following hours, Raymond observed how the fault line widened. The young translator, Linda, was quietly pulled from the room mid-morning. He overheard her being consoled by a middle manager in the hallway just outside the linguistics archive. She was trying to explain that the dialect used in the treaty wasn't standard Gulf Arabic, but a rare variant only spoken by a few thousand tribal elders across the Yemeni-Saudi border. Her voice cracked as she insisted she hadn't been trained in that variation, and the reply came swift and hollow. Then maybe this job isn't for you. Raymond, crouched nearby replacing a wall vent filter, didn't look up. He didn't have to. He had heard that tone before, years ago, directed at young soldiers unprepared for their first real mission, scapegoated before they could speak. That same afternoon, General Westbrook stormed into an impromptu session with the linguistics and diplomatic liaisons, demanding an immediate restructuring of the translation vetting process. The conference room erupted in thinly veiled panic. The pressure cooker of status, ego, and unspoken rivalries hissed louder with every passing hour. Nobody questioned whether the system itself was flawed. They only looked for someone to absorb the blame and another to step in who could be trusted. Trust in these halls rarely came with merit. It came with clearance, credentials, and the right lineage stamped across your personnel file. At 2:15 p.m., a tall civilian analyst named Davis stopped Raymond in the hallway not to talk to him, but to talk at him. Davis had dropped his ID badge and turned, spotting Raymond with his mop and bucket. Without thinking, he said, "Hey, Abdallah," or whatever, "mind picking that up for me?" Raymond bent slowly, picked up the ID, and handed it over wordlessly. The analyst didn't even make eye contact. "Thanks," he muttered, already halfway down the corridor. That kind of casual disregard was normal. The assumption that Raymond was probably Arab, possibly undocumented, and certainly not someone worth learning the name of was as predictable as the flicker in the fluorescent lights above the logistics room. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By evening, the day's chaos had reached its apex. A temporary translator had been flown in from Langley, escorted by 2 agents who looked like they hadn't slept in days. A new briefing was scheduled for the next morning, and classified material was being funneled into the secure archive with unusual haste.
The stakes were rising, and in the center of it all stood a crumbling illusion of competence stitched together by fragile egos and bureaucratic desperation. Raymond passed the Situation Room again on his second evening sweep, slower this time. Through the reinforced glass, he saw a flurry of activity. Charts being rearranged, digital maps being updated with new color-coded overlays, and uniformed officers pretending they weren't lost. One of the captains walked out and nearly bumped into him. Without glancing, he said, "Careful, buddy. This is a secure area." Raymond apologized softly, eyes down. The captain walked on, not realizing that the man he just brushed past had once read satellite intelligence off a Russian reconnaissance feed on memory, not because he had to, but because lives depended on it.
Even the janitorial supervisors had their biases. Raymond had once requested a temporary badge upgrade to access a malfunctioning keypad closet near the intelligence server room. His request had been denied twice, without review. "You don't need to be near that kind of equipment," his supervisor had said. "Just wait until tech support gets around to it." So he had waited 4 hours until the tech team showed up, only to discover Raymond had already fixed the wiring. He never explained how he knew which relay to reset. They didn't ask. Dismissal had become his armor. The more they underestimated him, the safer he was. Invisibility was the most effective form of security clearance he had ever possessed. But now, as the weight of error and panic pressed down on the command structure like a hydraulic press, Raymond sensed the ground shifting. The more they stumbled in their own assumptions, the closer they came to a revelation they weren't ready for. They didn't see it yet, but they would. The Pentagon's House of Mirrors was full of reflections, of titles, ranks, clearances, and egos. None of those reflections included the janitor. Not yet, but the cracks were starting to show. In the dim quiet of the maintenance annex, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional distant clang of a service door opening and closing, Raymond began his next shift as he always did. Early, silent, unnoticed. He wore the same navy blue coveralls with the faded Pentagon facilities patch stitched near the collarbone. His cart had the same mop, the same broken spray bottle handle, and the same rattling wheel. To the outside world, nothing had changed, and that was exactly how Raymond wanted it. But within him, something was shifting. The pressure of what he'd heard in the secure hallway the day before, the diplomatic blunder, the panic, the scrambling to plug holes in a leaky system, had triggered a familiar instinct in him. The one he had buried years ago when he walked away from operations and took a job cleaning floors beneath people who would never suspect who he was or what he once did. That instinct had reawakened, quietly, but unmistakably. He began to watch more closely, not with curiosity, but with precision. When a pair of intelligence officers argued in rapid, hushed voices in the hallway near the archival room, Raymond was polishing a metal bench nearby. Their words were clipped and guarded, but he caught the cadence of urgency in their tone. The phrases they used, Operation Amber Eyes, Delta Priority Override, Linguistic Fail Point, weren't part of the normal administrative noise that filled the corridors. One officer mentioned that the Saudis had requested a postponement on joint drills. The other said they were demanding a written clarification of religious phrasing ambiguities in the recent agreement. The phrase sounded sterile, bureaucratic, but Raymond heard the tremor beneath it. This wasn't just about syntax. It was about trust, about the kind of mistranslation that could unravel years of covert cooperation. Later, during a standard supply run to replace depleted cleaning chemicals in the logistics wing, Raymond passed a digital readout panel mounted in the wall. The panel had been malfunctioning for weeks, its touchscreen interface stuttered when swiped, and the maintenance team had already submitted 3 tickets for IT intervention. As Raymond walked by, he casually reached out and tapped a sequence of commands into the control module, just 3 precise inputs that temporarily bypassed the diagnostic screen and revealed the internal IP logs. For 3 seconds, he saw the shadow logs of classified file transfers routed through the server behind that panel. One of the most recent access points had originated not from Langley,
but from a non-registered uplink traced back to a non-NATO digital signature. That shouldn't have been possible. The implications ticked silently in his mind like a countdown. He cleared the panel display before anyone could notice. Back in the main hallway, Raymond swept the tiled floor outside the Strategic Language Analysis Unit, a glossy name for a poorly funded room filled with overworked civilian linguists who often relied more on AI-assisted translations than actual cultural nuance. He paused as he passed the desk of an older woman named Cheryl, who had been working there for years and still mispronounced basic Arabic terms. She was arguing with a new software interface. Raymond glanced over her shoulder at the screen. It displayed a section of a leaked transcript from a Yemeni tribal council discussion. The software had flagged one term as aggressive military posture. Raymond read it, blinked slowly, and knew instantly it was wrong. The phrase actually referred to a sacred mourning procession, a cultural rite, not a threat. But Cheryl clicked approve, and the mistranslation was locked into the system, ready to be referenced in the next intelligence assessment. Raymond moved on. Small things. That's how it began. Not grand heroics, just quiet corrections made when no one was looking. A faulty wire adjusted in a terminal switch box near the Situation Room after hours. A mislabeled crate of linguistic training materials rerouted to the correct department after Raymond accidentally signed off on the updated delivery manifest. A forgotten binder of dialectic cross-references left in a break room, pages hastily flipped through by Raymond pretending to wipe the coffee table. Every moment added another thread to a web he had begun weaving without fully realizing it. Then came the morning when Captain Holloway dropped his security badge while barking orders into a radio. The badge slid beneath a vending machine near the West Annex, where Raymond was cleaning the grout lines with a toothbrush.
The captain snarled something dismissive about getting the janitor to crawl under and grab it. Raymond retrieved it without a word, glanced at the embedded RFID chip as he passed it back, and noticed a faint irregularity, a barely visible indentation in the chip's housing that suggested tampering. Not enough to cause a breach, but enough to indicate it had been cloned recently. He said nothing, of course, but he logged the number in his memory. At 6:42 p.m., as the building settled into its evening lull, Raymond stopped at the break room vending machine and pressed a sequence of keys on the keypad, seemingly at random. The machine beeped, rejected the entry, and returned to its idle state. But the pattern wasn't random. It was a timing test. A delay in response indicated a misrouted relay, a sign that the auxiliary power in the maintenance grid had been rerouted, possibly to mask a covert server activity nearby. Again, Raymond made no report. He just swept, slowly, deliberately, in circles. Each of these moments was small, each was ignorable on its own, but together, they began to form a pattern, an invisible outline of Raymond's true competence. A man who never spoke unless spoken to, a man who never intruded, never overstepped. And yet, things near him began to work better, problems quietly solved, missteps quietly corrected. He remained quiet, but his actions began to ripple outward like drops in still water. And still, no one noticed. Not really, because Raymond had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. He had learned that if you moved slowly, if you looked humble, if you let them believe the story they told themselves about who you were, then you could do anything, even operate undetected within the most secure building in the country, even when it was falling apart from the inside. But it was only a matter of time before someone paid attention, before a mistake too large or a gesture too precise would draw eyes that had never once looked his way. The Pentagon didn't know it yet, but Raymond was already solving a crisis none of them fully understood. By the end of that week, tension gripped the upper halls of the Hartman Strategic Operations Building like an invisible vice, squeezing tighter with every passing hour. Something had gone wrong. Not just with the diplomatic agreement, not just with the translators, not just with the linguistics team, but with the deeper infrastructure of trust that held the Pentagon's clandestine machinery together. The kind of crisis brewing now was not explosive, not overt, but insidious. It grew in hushed meetings behind sealed doors.
in printouts shredded too late, in glances exchanged between generals when they thought no one was looking. And amid it all, Raymond swept the same hallways with the same cart, moving through the center of the storm as if he were caught in a different weather system entirely. At first, it had been easy to dismiss the growing number of minor incidents as isolated events. A misfiled intelligence report caused a 24-hour delay in confirming troop movements in a friendly zone. A field operative was nearly compromised because the word used for safe house in his coordinates report was mistranslated into something resembling market. A briefing between American and Omani officials had to be postponed indefinitely when their cultural liaison stormed out, offended by what he described as a deliberate insult encoded in a proverb. These weren't accidents. Raymond knew it in his bones. They were reverberations, echoes of a fracture in the system that had gone unchecked. The mistranslation that started this chain reaction wasn't an isolated linguistic slip. It had exposed something far deeper, a systemic vulnerability in the Pentagon's intelligence and language infrastructure, one that had quietly festered behind layers of false certainty and over-reliance on flawed protocols. And yet, instead of acknowledging the root of the issue, Command doubled down. More briefings, more external consultants flown in from Langley and Fort Meade, more temporary clearances issued to people who understood little about the cultures they were supposedly interpreting. It was like watching a drowning man thrash harder instead of learning to swim. Raymond observed this with the cold detachment of someone who had seen it all before, in foreign governments, in war rooms, in coalition alliances on the brink of collapse. When systems break, people rarely see the cracks until they're falling through them. At 7:05 a.m. that Monday morning, an alarm was triggered in the sub-level C wing. An encrypted linguistics archive had registered unauthorized access attempts 3 times in a 6-minute span. The system automatically initiated a soft lockdown, sealing the sublevel and alerting cybersecurity. Raymond was nearby, having just finished refilling a faulty air filter near the mechanical control room. He watched the lights shift from white to amber. The security team rushed in 2 minutes later, suits sharp, eyes wild, their radios spitting static laced with acronyms and panic. One officer ordered Raymond to stand clear, gesturing to the sealed doors like they were radioactive. Raymond stepped aside, nodded once, and wheeled his cart to the corner. But as the agent swiped into the override panel, Raymond caught a glimpse of the digital log flashing across the interface. The IP signature again, the same non-NATO uplink he had seen on the server panel 4 days ago. The breach wasn't coming from outside. It was bouncing through their own internal pathways, camouflaged like a ghost inside the walls. But no one knew that except him.
In the hours that followed, chaos metastasized. The linguistics archive was temporarily shut down, putting a full stop on all ongoing translation reviews. Meetings were postponed. Surveillance operations relying on real-time linguistic interpretation were stalled, delayed, or forced to rely on unverified machine-translated summaries, a dangerous compromise in the intelligence world. The foreign attachés who had once lingered in the hallways, glad-handing and sipping Pentagon coffee, now stayed cloistered in their private chambers, watching with cool distrust as their American counterparts scrambled to maintain composure. At noon, a classified satellite call between the U.S. and Jordanian security officials was aborted mid-session. The interpreter assigned had miscommunicated a phrase that, in context, sounded like an accusation of state-sponsored sabotage. The damage, though brief, was irreversible. An emergency task force was formed within the hour. General Westbrook himself chaired the meeting, flanked by senior staff and a new face, a Department of Defense civilian contractor who spoke confidently about linguistic redundancies and AI model recalibration, without once acknowledging the human dimension of cultural translation. It was window dressing, Raymond thought as he walked past the conference room with a floor buffer humming in front of him. No matter how shiny they made it look, the foundation was rotten. By late afternoon, the building had changed. The people in it moved differently. Gone was the casual arrogance, the offhand jokes in the cafeteria, the morning greetings between officers. The mood had turned brittle. People whispered more. Eyes darted toward security cameras. Everyone seemed to suspect someone else. The janitor, though, remained beneath suspicion. Always beneath. He walked slower not because he was tired, but because he was watching more. He cleaned longer in high-traffic zones, not for the dust, but for the voices. He lingered in stairwells because sound traveled better through narrow stone. Raymond was not just observing now. He was beginning to connect threads, and what he saw disturbed him. There was a pattern emerging, one no one else had the vantage point to see. It wasn't just linguistic failures. It was deliberate interference, subtle manipulation of meaning and context to provoke reactions from foreign governments. These weren't just technical glitches, they were chess moves. And whoever was making them knew the Pentagon's blind spots. They knew the language systems were weak, over-automated, and ripe for exploitation. They were exploiting assumptions about dialects, about regional customs, about the very meaning of words spoken through translators who didn't understand what they were carrying. Raymond felt the old instinct rising again, the one he had trained to suppress, the one that had once made him the best field linguist in 3 coalitions, the one that had kept peace in places where peace wasn't a word people even used. He had no clearance anymore, no gun, no badge, no name that mattered in the halls of power. But he still had eyes and ears and a mind trained to decode. The crisis wasn't just mounting, it was nearing collapse. And if no one else would stop it, he would. The change began subtly, like a draft slipping beneath a closed door. At first, it was nothing more than the way Raymond stood when no one was watching. His shoulders, once bent beneath the invisible weight of anonymity, began to roll back ever so slightly. His head, which habitually tilted downward to avoid meeting eyes, began to lift, not in arrogance, not even in defiance, but in readiness. It was the posture of someone no longer content to observe from the shadows. After years of playing the role of an invisible man, the pieces inside him had started to click back into place. Discipline, calculation, purpose. He hadn't dropped the facade completely, not yet, but the shift had begun, and the building would feel it before anyone understood what it meant. That Thursday morning, Raymond arrived at his post early, earlier than usual, even by his own standards. Before the first batch of security officers had passed through the metal detectors, before the coffee carts had rolled into the lobbies, before the lights in the war room even flickered on. He used a maintenance key, one he'd quietly copied years ago, to access a side room adjacent to the disused print server hub, a small, unmonitored space used for excess supply storage. He didn't need much time. Inside, behind a false panel in the vent shaft he had personally installed during a renovation 6 years ago, Raymond retrieved a sealed pouch. It was nondescript, black, dust-covered, no larger than a shoebox. Inside was a secondary ID badge under a long-retired clearance alias, an encrypted flash drive, and a folded note card containing handwritten passphrases in a cipher only 3 people in the world had ever been trained to recognize. 2 of those people were dead. The third was standing in that dim room, breathing through his nose, eyes closed, remembering a life he had been forced to forget. He did not wear the badge, not yet. He tucked it inside the lining of his work coveralls, along with the drive and the card. He would not announce himself, not until he had confirmation, because instinct told him the breach inside the Pentagon was not just digital, not just linguistic, but human. Someone on the inside, someone with access, was directing the manipulation of key communications. They weren't targeting secrets, they were targeting misunderstandings, the kind that could spark diplomatic fires that couldn't be put out with sanctions or statements. And Raymond knew that kind of attack could only come from someone who truly understood both languages, of culture and of power.
He began to act in ways that hovered at the edge of suspicion, but just shy of detection. In the linguistics wing, he accidentally disconnected the power to a translation server, claiming a routine floor inspection. In that brief window, he scanned the backup queue and verified what he already suspected.
The same mistranslated phrase about sacred land had appeared in 2 separate briefings to 2 different Middle Eastern partners, days apart, each one suggesting territorial claims where none had existed before. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was bait, dangled to provoke military posturing. Someone was creating friction zones, tiny sparks designed to set dry brush ablaze. In the cafeteria, Raymond stood near the edge of a conversation between a junior analyst and a foreign liaison aide. He didn't look up, didn't interrupt, but he listened as the aide mentioned how certain phrasing in a recent debrief sounded purposefully inflammatory. The analyst laughed it off, claiming the AI translation system was still being updated. Raymond memorized the liaison's name. Later that day, he found the liaison's assigned parking space and placed a note inside the aide's glove compartment, written in perfect Arabic. It was phrased as a riddle, but it contained coordinates, a meeting point, a time, a phrase to say if challenged. It was a dangerous move, risky, and could be seen as insubordination or worse. But Raymond didn't hesitate. He was no longer simply observing. He was acting, quietly, surgically, with purpose. On Friday afternoon, Raymond entered the mechanical access shaft behind the Department of Linguistic Security's restricted archive room. No cameras monitored the shaft. It was too narrow, too forgotten. There, behind the wall, he listened to a closed-door meeting between senior advisors discussing the containment of the translation errors. They were not trying to solve the problem anymore. They were trying to control the narrative. One of them mentioned a name, Graham. He recognized it instantly. Lucien Graham, a contractor embedded in the Pentagon's AI development lab, a former intelligence officer with clearance too wide and accountability too narrow. Years ago, Graham had been flagged for pushing experimental language manipulation programs that leveraged dialect-specific tone shifts to nudge psychological reactions in diplomatic transcripts. Raymond had personally reviewed one of his prototype proposals and rejected it, citing moral and operational risks. He remembered thinking, back then, that Graham had the ambition of a man who didn't care what happened after the bomb went off, as long as he was the one who dropped it. Now, Graham was back, embedded, and likely the architect of the chaos. The weapon wasn't a bomb or a bullet. It was a whisper, twisted words, misrepresented culture, phrasing designed to offend. Raymond didn't yet know how far it had spread, but he knew now who was behind it. And he knew, too, that he would have to expose it. Not by appealing to the chain of command, it was too thick, too wrapped in pride and protocol. He would need to force the truth into the light. And that meant stepping out of the shadows.
No one moved at first. The figure who stepped into the room did not belong there, not by role, not by clearance, not by appearance. He wore navy blue coveralls and carried nothing but a manila folder in one hand. His other hand rested lightly at his side, motionless. Raymond walked slowly, but with unmistakable intent. The assistant nearest the door turned, startled, and tried to object, but the room had already gone quiet. Not silent in shock, but still in that precise, eerie stillness that precedes a storm. Westbrook raised one hand, not in command, but in caution, unsure whether this was a security breach or something stranger. Raymond reached the table. His eyes scanned the room and rested on Westbrook. He placed the folder on the table and slid it forward without a word. The general did not reach for it. His voice, when it came, was low and edged with command. Raymond responded, but not in English. He spoke in Arabic, not the formal, studied Arabic of translators, but the earthy, lived-in dialect of someone born between borders, someone who had navigated tribal councils and rebel negotiations. It wasn't just the grammar that was perfect. It was the cadence, the rhythm, the weight of meaning layered into each word. He didn't translate anything. He spoke in the exact dialect that had caused the treaty misunderstanding, rephrasing the controversial sentence from the intercepted message with precision. Then, calmly and fluently, he explained what it actually meant. Not an act of aggression, a cultural blessing offered in veiled honorific form, a sign of deep trust, the opposite of what the Pentagon had interpreted. What they had feared as a threat was in fact a gift. The room was frozen. The assistant stared at Raymond like she had seen a ghost. One of the defense analysts stood up, stunned, as if trying to physically recalibrate what his eyes were telling him. Westbrook blinked, not once, but several times, and finally leaned forward to open the folder. Inside were printed screenshots of access logs, cross-reference translations with timestamps, and a small page of handwritten annotations in Arabic and English, side-by-side breakdowns of mistranslations with the correct cultural interpretations, complete with tribal context and emotional tone indicators. It was the kind of work no software could produce. This had been compiled by someone who didn't just speak the language, but understood the people who used it. Westbrook stared at the folder, then at Raymond. He didn't speak immediately. His instinct, built from decades of command, was to reject what he didn't authorize, to push back against breaches in protocol. But something about Raymond's presence made that impossible. He stood without apology, without fear. There was no groveling, no posturing, only calm certainty, a quiet gravity that couldn't be faked. The assistant finally broke the silence, stammering through a question, "Who are you?" Raymond's answer, this time in English, was simple. Not a janitor. He reached into the inner lining of his coveralls and removed the ID badge from years ago. The room's biometric reader wouldn't recognize the credentials. It had been wiped from the active database when his assignment was terminated, his history sealed. But those with long memories knew what the badge color meant. Deep black. Field Embedded Linguistics Specialist, Joint Operations. A ghost. The kind of asset that didn't exist unless they were needed, and if they appeared in a room like this, it meant something had gone very, very wrong. Raymond didn't linger. He laid out the sequence of manipulations he had tracked over the last 2 weeks. He named Lucien Graham. He detailed how the AI translation systems had been seeded with modified dialect models capable of twisting tone and meaning just enough to sow discord between allied nations. He explained the psychological strategy of introducing mistrust through language, a weapon that left no trace, only burned bridges. He walked them through 3 high-level examples already in play and 3 more that would detonate if not stopped within 48 hours. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't apologize for entering the room. Westbrook sat back in his chair and let the silence settle again. No one argued. No one dismissed him. Because they couldn't. Not after what they had just heard. The janitor had vanished. In his place stood a man who saw through walls, not with eyes, but with experience, with cultural fluency so refined it could stop a war before it started. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. He hadn't needed to demand authority. He had simply spoken the truth in the right language, the right way, and watched it land like a thunderclap in the middle of a room full of people who had never once looked at him. What happened next would ripple far beyond this basement room, but this moment, the moment when Raymond opened his mouth and reminded the entire Pentagon what real knowledge sounded like, this was the moment the tide turned. He stepped back from the table, nodded once to Westbrook, and walked out. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady, like a man who had done what he came to do. And for the first time in years, every single eye followed him. The building didn't quite return to normal after Raymond walked out of that conference room. Something had shifted. Not in the way of sweeping announcements or structural overhauls, but in the quieter spaces, in the pauses between conversations, in the sidelong glances, in the barely audible murmurs that passed through the corridors like echoes of something people couldn't fully explain.
The janitor had spoken fluent Arabic in front of a room of generals, advisors, and analysts. And not just fluent Arabic, but the kind of linguistically and culturally perfect Arabic that only deep native immersion could produce. In a place obsessed with control and security, Raymond had shattered the illusion that everyone in the building
already knew everything worth knowing. And now people were beginning to feel it. The weight of what they didn't know. The weight of what they had missed. Raymond didn't hide anymore, but he didn't advertise himself either. He still wore the janitor uniform, still pushed the same cart, still moved through the building with unassuming steps, but there was no mistaking the difference now. Officers stepped aside as he passed. Analysts watched him out of the corners of their eyes, half curious, half embarrassed, unsure if they should say something or pretend they hadn't spent the last year dismissing him. He didn't blame them. That wasn't the point. The lesson wasn't about revenge or superiority. It was about something deeper, something people had forgotten in their hunger for credentials and titles and categorized expertise. It was Major Leland who approached him first, awkwardly, near the south hallway where language specialists usually took their lunch. She was holding a thick folder under one arm and looked like she'd rehearsed what to say. Raymond didn't stop walking, but he slowed enough for her to match his pace. She told him she'd been reviewing the transcripts he had flagged and that he had been right, completely, irrefutably right, not just about the mistranslations, but about the cultural blind spots embedded into the entire AI processing system. She admitted that they'd outsourced too much nuance to algorithms trained on Western academic Arabic, and that they had missed key idiomatic layers, things that only someone raised between dialects, between meanings, could understand. Then, voice dropping, she asked the question he'd been waiting for someone to ask. How did we not see this coming? Raymond didn't answer right away. They passed two Marines at a vending machine. He nodded to them, and they both nodded back, uncertain but respectful. Only when they turned the corner into an empty corridor did he finally speak, and his voice was calm but unwavering. "You stopped listening," he said. "Not just to people like me, to anyone who didn't match your idea of what qualified looks like. You built systems to filter out human insight because it was messy, because it didn't scale. But culture doesn't scale. Language isn't math. You can't automate respect." Leland didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. Raymond continued. "You created a hierarchy where knowledge was ranked by presentation, not substance. And the people who could have warned you were already in the building. They were just cleaning your floors." Word of that conversation traveled, though not through official channels. A quiet domino effect began, first in linguistic security, then in defense interpretation, then in the auxiliary offices where cultural liaisons reviewed external comms. People started pulling up old reports, rechecking translations, inviting regional experts who had previously been sidelined. The focus shifted from technical fixes to relational understanding. They began calling it Raymond's principle behind closed doors, the idea that translation without cultural anchoring was not just incomplete, but dangerous. Then came the debrief sessions. Westbrook himself requested Raymond to attend, not as a janitor, but as a guest consultant. Raymond refused the title. He told them he wasn't there to be a consultant. He was there to help prevent the next crisis. He sat in the corner of the room, legs crossed, back straight, and explained to a dozen high-ranking personnel how a single phrase, mistranslated by an AI, had nearly ignited a multinational conflict. He broke down tribal idioms. He showed them the difference between what a word meant and what it implied. He taught them that speech in the Middle East was not always linear, that layers of humility, aggression, and hospitality could exist in the same sentence, and that if you stripped away tone and context, all you were left with was noise. It wasn't a speech. It was a lesson. And people listened. There was one moment during one of those sessions when a young officer asked Raymond why he had waited so long to reveal himself, why if he had seen these problems coming, he hadn't stepped in sooner. Raymond looked at the officer for a long time before answering. "Because when I tried, no one listened. Not until it was almost too late." The silence that followed wasn't shameful. It was sobering. Everyone in the room knew that they had created a structure where the loudest voices won, not the wisest.
And Raymond hadn't just revealed his identity. He had revealed the cost of ignoring the people who didn't fit the mold. By the end of the week, General Westbrook issued a directive to overhaul how language intelligence was handled across the board. Not just technical fixes, but structural reforms. They would bring in people, not just machines, who knew how to read between the lines. Retired diplomats, refugees, native speakers from diaspora communities, people who had lived the language, not just studied it. And at the heart of the initiative, he mentioned Raymond by name, not as a janitor, but as a critical field asset whose insights changed the course of national policy. Raymond didn't attend the ceremony. He had no interest in accolades. Instead, he stood in the old ventilation room where he'd once hidden the tools of his past. He removed the false panel one last time and slid the black pouch back into its hiding place.
Not out of fear, but because the moment had passed. His part had been played, the lesson had been delivered. What they did with it next was not his burden to carry. He walked the corridors that night slower than usual, pushing his cart beneath the buzz of fluorescent lights, passing the offices of people who now watched him with new eyes. Some nodded with acknowledgement, some looked away, uncomfortable in the presence of their own past assumptions. But a few, just a few, met his gaze directly, with respect that hadn't been there before. Not because he had spoken perfect Arabic, but because he had reminded them what it meant to truly understand another human being. The Pentagon didn't change overnight. That kind of institution never does. But something in its bloodstream had been altered. Not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. It started with small gestures. The security guards who once waved Raymond through without a second glance now greeted him with a nod that lingered a moment longer. The junior officers, formerly content to breeze past the janitor with clipped urgency, now slowed down, some even offering quiet acknowledgments, as if recalibrating their understanding of who belonged where. Raymond accepted these shifts with the quiet grace of a man who had never expected recognition and still didn't seek it, yet knew when it was deserved. In the weeks following the intelligence crisis, Raymond's name floated through circles that once pretended he didn't exist. His reports, once trashed or overlooked, were now quietly requested by the same linguistics team that used to scoff at the idea of a janitor understanding dialectical drift. He never gloated, never reminded them of the days when they wouldn't share a coffee pot with him. Instead, he shared what he had always held: insight, precision, and a depth of cultural understanding that no clearance level or credential could replicate. General Westbrook called him into his office exactly 13 days after the internal investigation confirmed what Raymond had already suspected. The translation algorithms had been manipulated. Not hacked, but subtly fed by a bad actor within their subcontracted network, exploiting the Pentagon's overdependence on machine translation to sow confusion and mistrust with foreign allies. Westbrook, a man built from military tradition and political instinct, stood behind his desk with none of his usual posturing. He simply extended a hand and said, "We owe you." Raymond didn't shake it. He offered a nod instead, subtle and respectful. That gesture alone seemed to disarm the general more than any confrontation could have. Westbrook, perhaps recognizing the weight of that humility, motioned for him to sit. They spoke, not of rank or service or bureaucracy, but of language, loyalty, and legacy. Westbrook asked if Raymond would consider rejoining under formal capacity, an advisory role, a cultural strategist, whatever title he wanted. Raymond declined, not out of bitterness, but principle. He told Westbrook something simple. The lesson was never about me. It was about what you stopped valuing. And that was the final word he offered on the matter. But what truly marked the transformation wasn't found in meetings or directives. It was in the ripple effect. Major Leyland, once skeptical, now led a new subcommittee focused solely on cross-cultural fidelity in intelligence operations. She made it a point to invite not just academics and analysts, but community members who had lived in the regions they discussed.
She asked questions differently now, less about grammar, more about meaning. She even circulated a memo internally titled What Raymond Taught Us, a document that would have been unthinkable just a month prior. In the break rooms, the tone shifted. Interns from immigrant backgrounds who once stayed silent now found themselves being asked about linguistic nuances, traditions, and idioms, not as a novelty, but as a necessity. Analysts stopped pretending that cultural fluency could be Googled. Raymond had restored something that had long been eroded by bureaucracy and ego: humility in the face of difference. Perhaps most surprising of all was the reaction from those who had dismissed him most openly. Lieutenant Parsons, the clean-cut intelligence officer who once ordered Raymond to keep his opinions to himself, now sought him out in the service corridors. He didn't apologize in words, not directly, but he showed up one afternoon with a folder of flagged transcripts and asked if Raymond had a few minutes to explain some of the deeper phrasing. Raymond didn't gloat. He read through the documents, offered corrections, and made notes in the margins. When he handed them back, Parsons met his eye and said, "I should have listened sooner." Raymond replied simply, "Now is still soon enough." The building itself began to reflect the shift. Raymond noticed a bulletin board near the linguistics wing featuring quotes from regional poets, not the sanitized, Western-approved kind, but actual gritty, real lines in native script with footnotes offering context. A small thing, maybe, but to Raymond, it meant someone was finally learning to listen. One evening, weeks after the crisis had passed and the Pentagon had begun to settle into a new rhythm, Raymond walked the hall near the Situation Room just after midnight. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that only existed in those deep, late hours when even the most obsessive analysts paused to breathe. As he turned the corner, he saw a new janitor, young, nervous, pushing a cart with uneven wheels. He was wiping down a vending machine when Raymond approached. The young man straightened up, clearly unsure of protocol.
Raymond nodded to him, then noticed the name tag. Kasim. Something in the way the boy's eyes shifted told Raymond everything he needed to know. This one was sharp, alert, watching, just like he had once watched. Raymond asked, gently, "Where are you from, Kasim?" The boy hesitated, then replied, "Tripoli, sir, but I've been here a few years now." Raymond smiled, not at the answer, but at the courage it took to give it without pretense. He clapped Kasim lightly on the shoulder and said, "Then you've got something this place needs. Don't forget that." Then he walked on. The Pentagon hadn't changed overnight, but it had changed. Relationships were no longer entirely shaped by badges, titles, or perceived status. Some were now shaped by respect. Hard-earned, yes, but lasting. And though Raymond still wore the same uniform, pushed the same cart, and answered to the same custodial schedule, everyone who mattered knew he was never just a janitor. He was the one who reminded them all that understanding begins when judgment ends.
Raymond returned the following day. No cart, no uniform, just the hard drive in one hand and a single sheet of handwritten translation in the other. He walked into the conference room where the Joint Intelligence Team had gathered, laid the paper down without flourish, and spoke one sentence that halted every breath in the room. "They're not warning us," he said. "They're summoning something." He explained what he had uncovered, that this was a message not for the West, but for insiders, that these transmissions were invoking an ancient belief system hidden within linguistic heritage, passed through generations, never written. That whoever was sending these signals was reviving a narrative built to mobilize a forgotten people. Not jihad, not politics, something older, something primordial. The room fell silent. The general in attendance, not Westbrook this time, but a younger man named Baylor, freshly promoted and eager to impress, asked what needed to be done. Raymond didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he did. And what needed to be done wasn't military. It wasn't even strategic. It was something the Pentagon had no protocol for. "You'll need to send someone in," Raymond said finally.
Someone who speaks like them, thinks like them, not to extract, to understand. The general frowned. You mean send you? Raymond looked him in the eye. No, he said. You're already too late for that. The intelligence community had grown used to patterns, predictable movements, political cycles, tribal alliances, and betrayals that moved like clockwork in desert heat. But this was different. The intercepted transmissions that Raymond had decrypted were more than coded warnings or incantations wrapped in ancient dialect. They were signs of motion, stirring, awakening. And in the days that followed his chilling statement, "You're already too late for that," the world began to tilt just slightly, then all at once. The first tremor hit the outskirts of Al-Halwan province, a long-disputed region that sat between the borders of 3 fractured nations, none of which had exercised stable control in over a decade. The local militias operating in the area were known entities, smuggling arms, trafficking influence, sometimes selling scraps of intelligence to foreign agencies in exchange for protection or money. But this time, something different happened. A compound long assumed to be a defunct Sufi shrine lit up with encrypted activity. Satellite scans showed a sudden surge in heat signatures, human movement, and the arrival of unidentified vehicles in the dead of night. The following morning, the shrine was gone, not destroyed, emptied, stripped clean of manuscripts, artifacts, and ancient scrolls that had supposedly been sealed for centuries. 3 days later, a remote listening post in Turkey picked up echoes of a frequency nearly identical to the Pentagon's initial intercept, only now it had evolved. Where before the messages had been layered and cryptic, they were now sharp and rhythmic. The cadence was unmistakably martial. This wasn't just an awakening, it was recruitment. Inside the Pentagon, tension coiled tighter than a drawn bowstring. General Baylor convened a crisis team composed of NSA codebreakers, DIA analysts, and a handful of cultural consultants flown in from academic institutions across the country. They worked in glass rooms, slept under desks, lived off caffeine and urgency. But still, no one could crack the full intention behind the transmissions. The only clarity came from the pattern itself. The signal was spreading, amplifying. Whoever was behind it had found a way to bypass not just American surveillance, but comprehension itself. And that, Raymond warned, was always the point. Outside those walls, the world responded in the way it always does when confusion meets threat, with escalation. France launched a series of preemptive raids near suspected enclaves near Mali. Russia issued a vague but aggressive warning about spiritual terrorism spreading across satellite states, followed by a mobilization of paramilitary assets. China locked down entire regions of western Xinjiang under the pretense of quelling extremist rumors. The world didn't understand what was happening, but it felt the shift. Something ancient was being spoken again, and the old powers didn't like the sound of it. Raymond watched this unfold from the margins. He wasn't on the crisis team, not officially. Baylor had accepted his choice to remain independent, though it was clear the general bristled every time Raymond appeared in the hallway, unannounced with a question or correction no one else had considered. Raymond did not enjoy being right, especially not about this. He had heard something in those chants that no one else had. A longing, a prophecy, a return not to violence, but to meaning. Whoever orchestrated the broadcast wasn't waging war in the traditional sense. They were reconstructing a worldview, one encrypted in memory and sorrow, built for ears raised in exile. Raymond spent his evenings listening to shortwave radio from across the globe. The static had become a kind of music to him, a dissonant symphony of warning and wonder. One night, somewhere between frequency 9.395 and 9.400 megahertz, he heard a voice that made his heart stall. It was in Hadrami, a dialect even rarer than the rest, spoken in a meter used only in pre-Islamic lamentations. The message was clear. A name, Al-Murshid. Not a man, a mantle. The guide. The one who would return, not as a warrior, but as a remembrance. He brought the translation to Baylor the next morning, the tension in his own shoulders uncharacteristically visible. Baylor scanned the document and looked up, eyes shadowed by sleeplessness and something else. Fear. "So this is a religion?" he asked, almost hopeful. "And ideology?"
Raymond shook his head. No, it's a story. One that never died. You buried it under maps and politics, but it lived. In chants, in riddles, in lullabies sung by refugees in places you never cared to listen. But what do they want? Baylor pressed. Raymond let the question hang. Then, quietly, they want to remember who they were before we renamed them. That was when the breach occurred. Somewhere in the department's foreign cyber intercept chain, a classified folder marked Echo Temple was remotely accessed, not corrupted, but duplicated. The security logs showed no known signature, no foreign malware trail, just a timestamp and a file relocation. Destination unknown. It meant one thing. Whoever had sent the first message now had access to the government's partial translation work. And they were watching, listening. The fallout was immediate. Baylor ordered an internal lockdown of all field linguistics programs. Intelligence liaisons were grounded. Even allied embassies were cut from intel briefings. The Pentagon began to look inward, to fear its own shadows. But the fear didn't slow the transmissions. In fact, it seemed to feed them. More messages, more locations. And this time, symbols. Drawings from ancient South Arabian tombs. Symbols associated with vanished kingdoms. Etched into sandbanks near strategic oil corridors. Raymond knew the old stories. He'd studied them not because he had to, but because they were his. Tales of cities swallowed by sand, of books written in ink mixed with ash and honey, of prophets who spoke in riddles so that only the faithful would understand. This wasn't about destabilizing governments or spreading chaos. It was about awakening a forgotten narrative, a resurrection of collective identity through ancient memory. Raymond knew that if the Pentagon couldn't interpret it, and soon, there would be no containing what was coming. The world wouldn't erupt in violence. It would fracture into silence. Quiet rebellion beneath every language the West didn't speak. And at the center of it all was a name they had not yet spoken aloud. Al-Murshid. The guide had not yet arrived, but he had been called. By the time the 11th transmission was intercepted, something fundamental had changed. It wasn't just the cadence or the language, or even the geographical source, though those had evolved too, but the tone. There was a new weight behind the words, as though the messages were no longer exploratory or probing, but directive. This one didn't ask. It summoned. No machine could decipher it. Even the most advanced speech recognition software froze in confusion, stuck between identifying the language as Proto-Arabic or a blend of extinct Bedouin meters that hadn't been spoken aloud in 1,400 years. But Raymond didn't need a computer to translate what he already knew in his bones. This one was a call to gather. The guide had spoken. The hunt had begun. Back in the Pentagon's deepest briefing room, General Baylor stared at a looping satellite feed from the outskirts of Hadramaut, an area previously dismissed as uninhabitable, now showing flickers of strange heat signatures moving in coordinated patterns across the desert floor. They weren't military formations. No known troop markers, no weapons visible, just figures. Dozens at first, then hundreds, traveling in straight lines toward an unmarked ravine known only in a handful of colonial-era field notes. Raymond, standing off to the side, recognized the pattern instantly. These weren't soldiers. They were pilgrims. Baylor was losing patience. In his mind, they were hemorrhaging time and power trying to translate ghost songs. The Joint Chiefs had been pressing him for something actionable. Drones, raids, something kinetic. But Raymond cautioned against it. If you strike without understanding the symbol, he warned, you turn their memory into martyrdom. Baylor ignored him at first, muttering something about janitors giving military advice. But the seeds of doubt had already been planted in him, and by the third emergency intelligence briefing in a single day, Raymond was invited back, not as a curiosity, but as a necessity. The CIA was already scrambling teams into the region. Assets were being reactivated, old tribal contacts shaken awake by encrypted messages with fat paychecks attached. It was a mess. The Americans weren't the only ones moving. Russian drones were now circling eastern Yemen. Turkey had increased intelligence gathering operations through their Cultural Diplomacy Corps. Even Iran, without saying a word publicly, had begun shifting its soft assets into nearby border regions, offering medical aid and historical preservation grants to any village elder willing to talk about sacred oral traditions. What no one realized yet, except Raymond, was that the real guide, the al-Murshid of the transmissions, was not a warlord, not a preacher. He was a librarian, a former keeper of a forgotten coastal manuscript hall, rumored destroyed decades ago in a bombing that had never been claimed by any nation. The man's real name was Abu Khalid Faraj al-Himiri, and he had vanished from every record just after the Second Gulf War. Raymond had remembered that name from a footnote in a thesis he'd read in his 20s. A man who memorized an entire book of Nabatean inscriptions and once translated an Aramaic dirge that referenced coordinates in the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. Raymond pulled the old document from his private archive and sat with it for hours. The dirge had a final verse that, at the time, no one had managed to decode. But Raymond decoded it. It was not a metaphor. It was a map. Somewhere inside the world's largest sand desert, where no satellite dared linger and no ground team could survive for long, lay what the transmission called Beit al-Sir, the House of the Secret. It was where Faraj was heading. It was where the chants were directing others.
And it was where something old and sacred, long buried under geopolitics and disinterest, was waiting to be found again. Raymond brought his findings to Baylor late that night. The general was alone in his office, staring at a blank report with the kind of exhaustion only men with stars on their collars could afford. Raymond placed a map in front of him, hand-drawn, not digital, with circles around places that no drone could reach. Baylor sighed. "You're saying this man, this librarian, is behind all of this?" Raymond nodded. "Not behind it, he's awakening it. He's the thread. The chant is just the needle." Baylor leaned back. "Then we send a team." Raymond hesitated. "No soldier will get close, not dressed like that, not with boots that crunch like foreign occupation. You need someone who can walk among them." Baylor looked up. "You?" Raymond didn't smile. "No, someone else. Someone they haven't heard from yet." "What does that mean?" Raymond tapped the map. "There's a woman in Basra. Her name is Salma Haddad. She teaches comparative linguistics and ancient dialects at a forgotten university. She used to be Faraj's student, until she disappeared too." Baylor exhaled through his nose, frustration and fatigue battling for dominance. "So this just became a manhunt." Raymond shook his head. "It was never a manhunt. It's a story, and if you don't respect the story, you lose the plot." By the next morning, the mission was greenlit. Not a military assault, not a drone strike, a listening mission. Raymond was sent in, not as a janitor this time, but as a civilian advisor embedded with a cultural diplomacy unit under the guise of a scholarly research initiative. His job was simple: track the signal, locate Salma, and, if possible, find Faraj. The Pentagon wanted eyes, but Raymond knew what they really needed was ears. As his plane lifted off from Andrews Air Force Base under the hush of early dawn, Raymond looked out the window and thought about all the voices he had heard over the years. So many dismissed, so many erased. He wasn't going back to listen for violence. He was going back to listen for memory, for meaning. And somewhere in the dunes, among chants and dust and riddles passed between desert winds, the story waited for its next chapter. The heat in Hadramaut did not feel like heat in any conventional sense. It was not just a matter of temperature or sunlight or air density.
It was a presence, oppressive and patient, like an ancient entity that had lingered long before man and would linger long after. The sand stretched in every direction like a boundless parchment, hiding secrets in its folds and offering nothing to those who had not earned the right to read its lines. Raymond felt it immediately, as the small blacked-out SUV bounced across the terrain, heading deeper into the southern desert, toward the place no one had ever officially named, but which old text whispered about as Bait al-Sir, the House of the Secret. He had landed in Mukalla under the fabricated identity of a visiting professor on sabbatical from Georgetown. His Pentagon handlers had outfitted him with a small team. 2 young analysts posing as research assistants, a local driver vetted by intelligence services, and an embedded cultural attaché who, although officially from the State Department, was clearly ex-CIA. Raymond recognized the look in his eyes, always scanning, always doubting. But this wasn't his operation. It was Raymond's. The coordinates he had provided were not exact. They weren't supposed to be. You couldn't find the house by following longitude and latitude. You had to listen. And that's what he had been doing since he arrived. Listening to wind patterns, to the rhythm of the calls to prayer, to the way old men spoke under their breath when the word Ikra came up. It was everywhere now, scrawled on crumbling walls in forgotten villages, whispered in markets, hummed in the cadence of lullabies. But no one claimed responsibility. That was the brilliance of it. The message had become organic, self-replicating, moving through the body of the region like a dormant virus recently awakened by a forgotten key. By the 4th day of their journey, they had abandoned the SUV. The terrain had grown too soft, too chaotic. They continued on foot, with 2 camels borrowed from a tribal elder who had said nothing during their negotiation except, "Do not come back the way you came." Raymond took that as a good sign. He knew they were close when the air began to shift, not in temperature, but in sound. The wind no longer whistled randomly. It moved with intention, curving in strange harmonics against the stones. Even the camels seemed uneasy. The CIA man, who had finally introduced himself as Keller, kept his hand near the concealed weapon at his side, though he hadn't spoken in hours. The younger analysts began muttering about dehydration and hallucinations, but Raymond ignored them. This was part of it. Just before dusk on the 7th day, they reached it. Not a building, not a ruin, but an indentation in the earth. A crescent-shaped depression surrounded by basalt pillars, each carved with inscriptions from a language Raymond hadn't seen since his time decoding tomb relics in Syria. He dropped to one knee and brushed away the sand. The script was Nabatean, but older, almost proto-Saban. He translated out loud without realizing. Those who forget the voice will wander the dunes. Those who hear it will walk into the fire and not burn. Keller looked around. You think this is Bait al-Sir? Raymond didn't answer. He was already walking down the hollow.
The air cooled as they descended, unnaturally so, as if they had entered a separate atmospheric pocket. At the center of the crescent was a flat stone, smooth as glass, marked only by a single handprint, not carved, but burned into the surface. Raymond hovered his hand above it. No heat, no vibration, just stillness. Then the voice came, not from a speaker, not from a person, but from beneath the stone, rising through the silence like steam through vents. A man's voice, old and steady, chanting in rhythmic, deliberate Arabic. Who reads the word commands the wind. Who forgets the word becomes the dust. Raymond knew that voice. Faraj. He was not dead. He was here. Or had been. Suddenly the wind shifted. A figure emerged at the edge of the hollow, draped in white robes stained with dust, her face obscured but unmistakable in posture and grace. Raymond stood still, not breathing. "Salma," he whispered. She lowered her veil, her eyes met his.
You came too late, she said, not with malice but with finality. Behind her, other figures emerged, silent, steady, some barefoot, others with tribal sashes across their shoulders, dozens. They did not speak. They only stared. At Raymond, at Keller, at the analysts who by now were frozen in confusion and awe. Salma stepped forward. Faraj is not here, but his voice is. He gave it to the sands, and now the sands have given it to us. Raymond felt his heart beat with something that was not fear, but recognition. This was not a military event. This was not terrorism or extremism. This was a cultural reawakening, hidden beneath the layers of neglected history and linguistic arrogance. These people were not following a prophet. They were reviving a memory that colonialism, war, and modernization had tried to erase. Raymond looked at Keller. You brought a weapon. You think this is war. Keller didn't speak. He lowered his eyes. Raymond stepped forward, voice steady. Then what is it? Salma looked toward the horizon, where the sun was dying behind a dune's shoulder. This is remembrance, she said. The world has forgotten how to listen. We are here to teach it again. No one moved. The desert held its breath. Raymond felt the weight of it, the gravity of something much older than nation-states, than codes and clearances and ranks and medals. He had followed the chant into the fire, but he was not burning. He was beginning to understand. The night did not fall so much as it crept. In the desert basin of Bait al-Sir, twilight lingered in strange gradients, as if reluctant to surrender the sky entirely to darkness. Fires flickered between the basalt pillars, not for warmth, but for ritual. No one spoke unless absolutely necessary, and when they did, it was in low tones, deliberate, ancient, reverent. Raymond sat cross-legged near the edge of the crescent, his mind thick with the dust of revelation, watching shadows play against the stone handprint. His thoughts moved in circles. Not panic, not confusion, but a strange tranquility beneath the weight of clarity, the kind that came only after a long walk through layers of pretense, noise, and institutional blindness. This was what Faraj had meant. This was what Salma had tried to protect, and this, Raymond now knew, was what the Pentagon had been deaf to from the beginning. Faraj had never disappeared. He had chosen erasure not to escape danger, but to preserve something the modern world had been systematically dismantling. He had returned not to fight, but to plant a seed, a linguistic seed, one that would grow only in silence, among those who could still hear the bones of language, who could still decipher meaning in rhythm, cadence, and oral memory. And now that seed had bloomed into a movement that neither government nor satellite nor algorithm could detect in time. Raymond had been brought here not to stop it, but to understand it, and perhaps, though they would never say it aloud, to be a witness. Because some truths, some shifts in history, required a witness more than a report. Salma sat beside him now, her eyes watching the flames, but her thoughts somewhere deeper. Her voice was soft when she spoke. Faraj always believed the collapse would begin not with weapons, but with forgetfulness. Not bombs, but the silence of language. When a people forget their stories, they forget their strength. Raymond nodded. And so he made his story unforgettably strange. She allowed herself a small smile. Exactly. He looked out at the gathering. They were not soldiers. They were linguists, oral historians, tribal archivists, poets, defectors from the formal academic world, all drawn here by the same phrase that had bewildered the Pentagon's most advanced systems, Ikra. Not a code, not a threat, a call. To read, to remember,
to reclaim. And they had, not with violence, but with narrative. By reviving dialects long buried under the weight of empire, by reciting tales passed through unbroken oral chains, by decoding the sacred geometry of cadence that defied all machine learning models. It was not just language, it was an insurgency of meaning. Raymond turned back to Salma. They'll never understand this back home. They don't need to. Only one of you needs to. It took him a moment to realize what she meant. You brought me here to take it back. Salma didn't answer. She didn't need to. Keller stood some distance away, tense, arms folded, still scanning the horizon like a soldier dropped into a dream he couldn't wake up from. The two younger analysts had stopped asking questions hours ago.
They simply watched now, recording nothing, but absorbing everything. Maybe they would leave changed, maybe not. But Raymond would. He already had. One of the elder men in the gathering, a rail-thin figure with skin like polished stone and eyes that seemed older than time, stepped forward and began to chant, slowly, rhythmically, in a blend of Akkadian, Sabaean, and Quranic Arabic that made no literal sense, but resonated with something primal. The fire bent slightly inward with each repetition, as if even the elements leaned closer to listen. The others joined in, one by one, until the crescent basin echoed with the layered harmony of 10, then 20, then 50 voices, weaving a tapestry of sound no computer could translate, no foreign agency could intercept. Raymond closed his eyes. It wasn't just a chant, it was a transmission, one meant for memory, not machinery. When the chant ended, the elder approached Raymond and placed in his hands a small, leather-bound object, not a book, not exactly, but a stack of stitched parchment inscribed with phonic symbols he barely recognized. The ink was faded in some places, bold in others. Some of it was poetic meter, some of it musical notation, and some cryptic invocations that defied translation but demanded reverence. "This," Selma said, "is the root." Raymond held it as if it might evaporate. "What am I supposed to do with it?" She stood. "You already know." And he did. The Pentagon would want to see it. They would scan it, decode it, maybe dismiss it. But that wouldn't matter, because Raymond had seen its power not on the page, but in the air, in the way it moved people, in the way it wove silence into signal. And no amount of analysis could replicate what he had just experienced. But maybe, just maybe, his retelling could spark a sliver of awareness, a hesitation, a new humility. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, Raymond knew it was time to leave. The desert had given him its answer. It was not one he could bring back in a suitcase or a report. It was in him now, and whether the Pentagon would listen was not the point. The point was that someone had to carry it, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. Because this war had never been about land or oil or terror. It had always been a war over memory. And for the first time, Raymond realized he had not been summoned to stop it, he had been summoned to remember it. When Raymond stepped back into the Pentagon, it felt colder than he remembered, not in temperature, but in tone, a sterile, humming austerity that seemed almost hostile after the warmth of Beit al-Sir's winds. The gleaming hallways, the synchronized footsteps, the polite but clipped exchanges between officers, everything felt rehearsed, like language stripped of meaning, reduced to protocol. He carried no briefcase, no formal report, just a worn canvas satchel over his shoulder, containing the leather-bound root text, wrapped in muslin, smelling faintly of sand and ancient ink. As he walked through security, no alarms rang, no flags were triggered. It seemed almost symbolic. The most dangerous thing in the building wasn't metal or weaponized. It was an idea.
General Westbrook had returned from diplomatic meetings overseas and called for a classified debrief the moment word reached him of Raymond's arrival. The story of the linguist janitor had become more than internal legend. It had evolved into a quiet paradox, the kind of contradiction the system couldn't comfortably hold. Half of the brass still saw Raymond as an eccentric relic of a different era. The other half suspected he was now the Pentagon's most valuable, if inconvenient, asset. In the dim-lit operations room where sensitive briefings were held, the mood was tense. General Westbrook sat at the head of the long table, flanked by linguists, intelligence officers, 2 State Department envoys, and Keller, who looked more drawn than ever, thinner, more alert, as though he hadn't slept since they returned. Raymond walked in slowly, placed the satchel on the table without a word, and then looked each person in the eye before he spoke. What you intercepted was not a code, not a tactical plan. It wasn't even directed at you. It was a call to memory sent from the root of a culture that remembers what we've forgotten. That language isn't just for communication. It's for connection, identity, continuity. No one interrupted. For once the room was silent without being skeptical. He continued, his voice measured, almost ritualistic. These people were never trying to attack us. They were never trying to declare war. They were reminding their own, not just of who they were, but of what had been buried. Their words weren't aimed at our ears. We were never the audience. That's why the machines failed. That's why the AI scrambled. He reached into the satchel and carefully unwrapped the leather-bound book, laying it open. The symbols shimmered faintly under the table's overhead lights. Some leaned in, others stared from a distance, unsure whether to treat it as intelligence or artifact. Raymond let them look. Then he spoke again. This is a living document. It can't be digitized. It changes as it's spoken, passed through voices. Some of it only makes sense when it's sung or when chanted in rhythm with the pulse of your own breath. You won't be able to extract it, but you can experience it. That's the difference. General Westbrook cleared his throat, trying to maintain a mask of composure. So what do you recommend we do with it?
Raymond met his gaze. You listen to it. With people, not tools. You bring in those who've been ignored. Your own heritage specialists, your anthropologists, your field linguists who are pushed out for being too abstract. You humbled the system. A quiet murmur ran through the room. One of the younger officers asked, "So this movement, are they a threat?" Raymond shook his head. "They're a reminder. That's what makes them dangerous to empires." He let the words settle. Then he added, "And if you treat them like a threat, you'll become the very thing they're trying to outlast." Keller finally spoke, his voice tight but sincere. "And what about you, Raymond? You going back?" Raymond looked down at the parchment. "No, I've already done what they asked. I carried the story. Whether you understand it isn't up to me anymore." Westbrook leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You realize you've just handed us something that has no precedent, no category." Raymond gave a faint smile. "Exactly. That's why it matters." The meeting broke in confusion. Some stormed out in frustration. Others lingered, whispering theories, requesting scans, photographing the open text, even as they sensed it wouldn't yield to lenses. Raymond stood silently, gathering his things, as though he had already moved beyond the need for persuasion. The wisdom had been offered. Whether they would absorb it was no longer his burden. Later that afternoon, Keller found Raymond alone in the observation corridor overlooking the Potomac, watching boats slip silently across the water. The sun glinted against the river's surface in fractured lines, and for a moment, there was no war, no language, no secrets, just movement. Keller stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "You think it'll change anything?" Raymond didn't look at him. "Not yet, but eventually." Keller nodded. "You're a strange man, Raymond." Raymond finally smiled.
That's because you're still seeing me through the wrong frame. What frame should I use? Raymond turned to face him, eyes calm. The one where the janitor was always the librarian of forgotten truths. Weeks passed, then months. And like all things that brush against the rigid machinery of government, the storm Raymond had stirred began to settle. Not with resolution, but with discomfort. The Pentagon, unwilling to admit it had underestimated a janitor-turned-linguistic savant, quietly redirected its resources into a discrete task force on nonlinear cultural signaling. Of course, they never mentioned Faraj's name. They never publicly acknowledged the desert gathering, never admitted the root text had cracked open a fault line in their understanding of language and power. But behind closed doors, those few who had sat in the debriefing room with Raymond carried something different in their demeanor. A hesitation before dismissal. A pause before interrupting someone whose importance wasn't obvious. Raymond himself had retired, formally, finally, and on his own terms. He declined the quiet offer to consult, to advise, to become some kind of soft power ambassador between old world wisdom and modern military intelligence. He had no desire to be paraded as a trophy of Pentagon enlightenment. His work was never meant for boardrooms. Instead, he moved to a coastal town in Maine, a place with long winters and longer silences, where he took up work in a community library that still stamped books by hand and hosted weekly storytelling nights for children and retirees alike. He never spoke of Beit al-Sir, unless asked directly. And even then, he responded with metaphors, not names. Keller visited him once, unexpectedly, late in the fall. The young man had changed. Not in appearance, he still wore sharp-cut suits and moved with the clipped tension of someone trained for combat, but there was something softer behind his eyes, a questioning nature that hadn't been there before. He brought a bottle of whiskey and a folder of papers. They sat on Raymond's porch as the wind combed the pine trees, saying little for the first hour. When they did speak, it wasn't about tactics or transcripts or artifacts. It was about perception. How easily people in power could confuse stillness with ignorance and noise with intelligence. Keller admitted quietly that he had begun to reevaluate the way he looked at every civilian, every cleaner, every outsider in military installations. Not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Respect. Raymond said little in response. He didn't need to. The shift in Keller was enough. One transformed mind was more valuable than 1,000 uncomprehending reports. Back at the Pentagon, General Westbrook never officially changed his stance on the incident. He remained the same stern-faced architect of strategy, the same methodical executor of national defense. But behind closed doors, he began to approve funding for unconventional cultural programs, expanded the department's hiring pool to include more ethno-linguists, and even made it policy to require that every new recruit in intelligence operations spend time shadowing field anthropologists. A subtle, unspoken nod to the lesson learned, though it was never called that in writing. Bureaucracies don't admit their revelations. They reflect them sideways. The younger officers who had accompanied Raymond to the desert submitted resignations in the months that followed. One went to work with a nonprofit focused on preserving endangered dialects in North Africa. Another began writing a memoir, not about combat, but about the silence in between orders and the voices lost in translation. Neither of them contacted Raymond again, but he received postcards, always with only 2 words on them. Ikra. Remember.
Whispers of similar gatherings in the Sahel, in the mountains of Yemen, in forgotten oases where oral languages were resurfacing with renewed energy. No formal network, no chain of command, just stories passed across firelight, songs sung in dialects long considered dead, and chants that bent satellite signals into irrelevance. She never reached out to Raymond. She didn't need to. Their roles had always been understood. She was the guardian of the story. He was the bridge. As for the root text, it was never archived. Raymond refused to hand it over to any agency or institution. Instead, he placed it in a cedar-lined box in the library's storytelling room, where it rested among local folk tales and children's legends. Occasionally, he would remove it, unwrap it, and sit with it in silence, letting the rhythm of its pages wash over him. He never read it aloud, not because it was forbidden, but because some stories speak best in stillness. In time, a quiet myth grew around him. Locals referred to him as the linguist in the lighthouse, though there was no lighthouse nearby. Children said he once spoke 1,000 languages in a single breath. Retired Navy men swore he'd been a spy. Librarians said he was just a man who listened better than most. And Raymond never corrected them. He had no need to explain who he was. He had already revealed enough, not with a speech or a dramatic confrontation, but with a single truth carried out of the desert like a spark. That truth was simple. Wisdom does not demand attention. It waits. It watches. It listens. And when the world finally gets quiet enough to hear it, it answers. The janitor had never been just a janitor. The linguist had never needed validation. The desert had never been empty. And the Pentagon, in all its might, had been humbled not by a weapon, but by a whisper. The moral remained: never judge a person by their uniform, nor a culture by its silence. Because the next great transformation may not come from a general, or a machine, or a missile. It may come from the man mopping your floor, speaking perfect Arabic. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.